Hi, my friends. Today I want to present you a new story. Enjoy watching it.
The emptiness of the house stretched out before me as I walked downstairs that morning, greeted by the same indifferent silence that had taken over since Dennis and his kids moved in. I lingered on the last step, listening to the faint murmur of their voices coming from the kitchen. They were talking softly, sharing their morning laughs as if they were the only ones who lived here. Taking a breath, I stepped into the kitchen, my attempt at a morning greeting fading into the air. Dennis' back was turned to me, his arm casually resting on his son's shoulder. His daughter sat beside him, eyes fixed on her cereal bowl. The chatter faded as I entered, the room growing so still I could hear the quiet clink of a spoon against porcelain. "Morning," I said, forcing a smile. Dennis didn't even turn. His son glanced at me and quickly looked away, as though eye contact was forbidden. It stung, but I tried to brush it off. Instead, I took a seat at the far end of the table and poured myself a bowl of cereal, my movements slow, listening for any hint of acknowledgement. "Pass the milk?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Dennis continued his conversation with his daughter, who handed him the milk without a word, avoiding my gaze. They ignored my request entirely, as if I hadn't even spoken. My grip tightened on my spoon. I tried to eat, but every bite felt like chewing on nails. Mom walked in then, her face lit with a smile that dimmed the moment she noticed me. She quickly glanced between us, her expression slipping into that familiar, faintly irritated look that seemed reserved just for me. "Eric, why don't you clear your place when you're done?" she said, her tone scolding as if I'd left a mess, though my bowl was still half full. I nodded, my stomach nodding. "Sure." Her gaze softened as she looked at Dennis, her voice light. "I'm heading to work early today. Dennis, you and the kids don't have to wait up for me tonight." I sat in silence, every word they exchanged feeling like a wall being built around me. Dennis responded with a smile, his tone warm and inviting, a tone I hadn't heard him use once with me. When Mom finally turned to leave, I caught her arm, my voice slow but determined. "Can we talk later, Mom? Just you and me?" A flicker of annoyance passed over her face. "Eric, I don't have time for this right now," she said, freeing her arm from my grip. "You need to start being more cooperative. I've made enough sacrifices for you already." Her words sank like lead. As she turned away, the coldness of the room settled over me completely, leaving me in a silence more powerful than anything spoken. Watching them gather their things and head out, I realized something. I wasn't just an afterthought here, I was invisible. I sat in my room that night, the house cloaked in the heavy quiet that settled in once Dennis and his kids retreated behind their closed doors. My fingers traced a small scratch on my desk, a scar from some long-forgotten mishap. Mom's words echoed in my head, repeating like a broken record. "I've made enough sacrifices for you already." A wave of guilt crashed over me, unexpected and uninvited. It tightened my chest, making me feel like every breath I took was a burden on her. But why should it feel that way? I hadn't asked her to sacrifice anything, yet somehow, every complaint or lonely moment in this house was now my fault. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to yell just to break the silence that choked me. Footsteps padded softly outside my room. I held my breath, half hoping it was Mom, maybe coming to talk. But the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I was alone again. The next morning, as I poured myself a cup of coffee, Mom walked in, dressed and ready to leave. I took a breath, determined to try again, to clear the thick fog of resentment between us. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, "do you think maybe you could talk to Dennis? I don't think he realizes how isolated I feel." She paused, glancing at me with a flicker of something I couldn't read. Then she sighed, her expression hardening. "Eric, I don't want to keep having this conversation," she said sharply. "You know what I've given up for you. You're nearly an adult now. It's time you learn to handle things on your own. But I'm just asking for." "Enough." She cut me off, her voice low but firm. "It's not always about you, Eric." A sharp pain lanced through me. I lowered my gaze, clenching my jaw. "It's never about me though, is it?" Her face softened for a split second, but she quickly gathered herself, stepping back and reaching for her bag. "We'll talk later," she muttered, avoiding my gaze as she hurried out of the kitchen. The door closed behind her, leaving me in the suffocating silence once again, the weight of her words pressing down like a stone in my chest. As I watched her drive away, I realized the guilt she'd planted in me had taken root, feeding on every cold interaction and dismissive glance. The weight of it was almost too much to bear, and yet, somehow, I knew I'd have to carry it alone. I woke up to an unusual quiet, sharper and emptier than the usual silence that filled our house. It was almost eerie. No muffled footsteps. No clinking dishes from Dennis or his kids at breakfast. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, listening. Not a single sound. Throwing on a hoodie, I crept down the hall, peeking in the kitchen. Empty. No breakfast leftovers, no coffee, no jackets tossed over chairs. My heart thudded, each beat louder than the last. I checked the living room, silent. The TV remote sat untouched. I felt my pulse quicken as I moved to my mom's bedroom. I hesitated, swallowing, before I opened the door and looked inside. It was completely still, the bed perfectly made. Their suitcases were gone. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I bolted back to the kitchen and yanked open the fridge. Inside, a single note was stuck to the door, scribbled in Mom's handwriting. Gone for a few days. Make sure you lock up. I stared at the note, trying to process it. They'd left, all of them, without a word. My throat tightened as I read the note over again. Make sure you lock up. That was it. No explanation. No, we'll be back soon. Just instructions, as if I were some guest in their house. I crumpled the note, anger flaring up like a match inside me. The sound of a neighbor's dog barking startled me, and I jumped, the sound making the silence around me feel even more intense. I paced the kitchen, muttering to myself. They didn't even tell me. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my spiral. A text from my friend Jay. Hey man, wanna hang later? I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? My family had left me behind, without a single thought. I finally texted back, can I crash at your place tonight? Jay replied almost instantly, sure. What's up? I paused before typing, long story. Just family stuff. As I hit send, a fierce determination settled in me. They'd left without a word, as if I didn't matter. Well, fine, I'd leave too, without looking back, and maybe they'd finally notice the absence they'd created. The moment Mom walked through the door, her face froze as she saw me waiting. Her eyes flickered with a hint of annoyance rather than guilt, as though my presence were a mild inconvenience. Dennis and his kids shuffled in behind her, carrying bags, talking among themselves, oblivious to the tension gathering in the room. Didn't expect you here, she muttered, setting her bag down, not meeting my eyes. I stood up from the chair, the silence between us growing taut, nearly crackling. Didn't expect to be left behind, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though anger was coiling in my chest. Did you all just forget I live here? Her expression hardened. Eric, don't be dramatic. We went for a few days, that's all. It was a last-minute thing. Last minute? I couldn't help it. The anger slipped out, sharp and cutting. You didn't think to text, or leave an actual note. Dennis cleared his throat, stepping in as if he had any right. Listen, kid, it wasn't a big deal. You're old enough to handle yourself. I wasn't talking to you, I shot back, barely able to contain myself. My gaze turned to Mom again, searching for even a trace of remorse, but there was nothing, just a tired, dismissive glance. Eric, please, she sighed as if I were making this all harder than it needed to be. It was just a few days. You're acting like we abandoned you. I laughed bitterly. That's exactly what it felt like, Mom. A long silence settled between us, dense and unyielding. Finally, she shook her head and started for the kitchen. We'll talk about this later. But I couldn't let her brush it off. Not again. No, we're talking about it now. She stopped, her back to me, and I could see the irritation in the way she stood, her shoulders tense. Fine. She turned around, arms crossed. What do you want me to say, Eric? That I should have thought about you more? Is that it? I stared at her, all the words I'd rehearsed falling away. I wanted to feel like I mattered, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her expression softened for a moment, but then Dennis interrupted, scoffing. Come on, Eric, don't be so sensitive. This isn't some sob story. Maybe it is, I said, glaring at him. But it's mine. With that, I turned and walked out, leading the house in stunned silence. I stood by the front door, my bag packed and my heart pounding. Mom watched me with a look I couldn't quite read, maybe surprise, maybe disbelief. Dennis lingered behind her, arms folded, his face showing nothing but impatience. You can't be serious, Eric, Mom said, her voice low but tense. Where would you even go? To Dad's, I replied simply, gripping the bag's handle so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I couldn't bring myself to soften it. Every ounce of betrayal I felt pushed me forward, driving me to finally break away from the cold indifference that had worn me down for so long. Mom sighed, glancing at Dennis. Eric, this is your home. I know things haven't been perfect, but you'll just make it harder on yourself if you leave now. I shook my head, keeping my gaze fixed on her. Harder? I've been here this whole time. feeling like a stranger to my own house. You left me alone, didn't even tell me where you went. You don't get to tell me what's hard. Dennis rolled his eyes, cutting in. Honestly, Eric, you're overreacting. You have everything you need here, don't you? I met his gaze, unflinching, except respect. For a moment, silence fell between us, heavy and loaded. I turned back to Mom, searching her face one last time, hoping for some sign of remorse. But all I found was a quiet resignation, as though she'd already accepted that I was leaving and had chosen to let it happen without a fight. Fine, go, she said finally, voice almost hollow. If that's what you need to do, I won't stop you. I nodded, feeling the weight of her indifference settle on me like a final blow. Without another word, I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cool air hit my face, filling me with a strange sense of liberation. I was leaving everything behind, the cold, the isolation, the sense that I didn't belong. As I walked down the driveway, I heard the door close behind me, a sound that somehow felt like the closing of a chapter, maybe even a whole book. The feeling was bittersweet, but mostly it was freeing. This was my choice, my way of taking control. I took a deep breath, looking down the street, ready to move forward into the unknown. And just then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Curious, I pulled it out and saw a message from Mom. It was a single line that made me freeze in place from the horror of what I was seeing. I never wanted you to stay. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the screen, feeling a deep, unexpected ache. In response, I texted her, I love you too, Mom. God is your judge. And as I turned, walking away from the only home I'd known, I realized that maybe this was what I needed all along, an ending as raw and final as the words on my phone. In the silence, I whispered to myself, goodbye.
Friends, what do you think of this story? Write your opinion in the comments. Would you like more stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss any videos. See you tomorrow.